My name is Jennifer Baker. I'm one of the legislative advocates with CalRTA, and we're joined today by David Walrath, who is the premier expert on teachers' retirement, is one of the most knowledgeable individuals I've ever known on these issues. And we also like to go back and forth on our ideas and speculations on which we think will happen. So we're going to have a conversation today that's building on last week's workshop. So if you haven't had a chance to watch the workshop last week, I'd encourage you after this, go ahead and watch that, and it's going to help much of this to make even more sense for you. What we're going to be talking about this morning are what are some of the major issues that CalSTRS is going to be facing over the next 5 years. We're going to be looking into that crystal ball. We're going to be covering quite a few economic, political, educational issues that can impact CalSTRS. I did want to note that we have a couple of protocols today. You don't necessarily need to worry about your surroundings, but I would like to ask you if you could please ensure that you have muted yourself, and if you don't mind turning off your screen as we get going, your video, that would be great. If you do have questions, if you can include those questions at the chat box that's at the lower part of your screen, you'll see a little box that comes up that says chat. If there is a question that's pertinent to the topic that we're covering, we'll try to integrate those questions as we move along. But we are going to make sure to have some extra time at the end of the workshop to answer as many questions as possible. With that, we're going to go ahead and get started. We're going to cover a few items today. We're first going to have a conversation about some of the different perspectives on the contribution rate to CalSTRS, the defined benefit plan, what that rate is, what any potential future changes could mean. There are a number of conversations that are already taking place and will be taking place over the next few years. We're going to have some discussion over the existing funding plan, how stakeholders are responding to that, and speculating for some scenarios that might happen. We're also going to talk about the budget process and how changes in that process are shifting due to a number of new economic factors. We're going to discuss briefly how that can impact the education budget, and then how that also impacts CalSTRS and our pensions. We're also going to discuss how some of the funding conversations could impact the SBMA. For those that may not be familiar with the SBMA, that stands for the Supplemental Benefit Maintenance Account. That's the account that provides purchasing power protection that helps to ensure that our most senior retirees retain at least right now 85% purchasing power. We're also going to talk a little bit about statute of limitations and audits, and how some of the other B issues with CalSTRS actually may be impacted by some conversations about contribution rates. Finally, we're going to talk about some threats from opponents of defined benefit plans. We are already seeing some major attacks. We're going to talk a little bit about those and what we're doing to make sure that we're on top of that. So the first thing that we're going to do is talk about contribution rates and the unfunded actuarial obligation. We're going to use some very big academic words today, but we're really going to break them down and explain what does that mean. That means the shortfall, the existing shortfall to the CalSTRS plan. We're going to go down a few rabbit holes on this first section. So Dave, I'm going to turn it over to you to help to shed some light on some of these fiscal mysteries.
Thank you, Jennifer, and it's a pleasure to talk to you and talk with you today. Thank you, everybody, for tuning into this webinar. Some of this will be very technical. Jennifer and I could probably spend an hour just on what is an unfunded actuarial obligation. So let me start by defining the terms. And we'll start with the last one, the O, obligation. Essentially, in a defined benefit plan, the obligation are the benefits that were earned through the formulas of that plan. Years of service, compensation level, those type and age of retirement, all of that are part of the obligation. And who has that obligation? It is essentially an obligation of the state of California, because the state of California is the plan sponsor for the California State Teachers Retirement System plan. Because the state of California includes everybody in the state government, it also has the obligation for the employers and the employees. We're all part of this obligation in ensuring that there's adequate resources to pay for the benefits that are earned. How is it calculated?
This is one of the guys I work with. He's a lawyer. I'm gonna have to put more look at this.
Yeah, Clint, if you could mute. So how is it calculated? It's calculated
They just heard me say.
on the basis of how much in the terms of the formulas of the defined benefit system, how much has been earned already. This is not projecting future earnings and the funding for future earnings or future service. It is talking about the funding for service already performed. Then you look at how much in the way of assets are available. You look at the assets and you make assumptions on those assets, such as how much will CalSTRS be able to earn on its assets that have been invested? How much has been paid for that, those assets, and what is the difference? That difference is the actuarial unfunded actuarial obligation. So when you hear CalSTRS is 67% funded, that means CalSTRS has assets, and given their projections of earnings on those assets, will be able to pay 67% of the already earned benefits. If you hear it's 80% or 95%, all that means is the difference between the available assets as projected to grow for already earned benefits are short, and what percentage. In dollar terms, the current unfunded actuarial obligation is about $107 billion. What are some of the factors that you'll be looking at? And we'll get to normal cost a little bit later on, because normal cost is how much do you need in contributions? How much do you need in new assets that year for the service that is being earned in that year? The next slide will go into a little bit on normal cost, but this slide is on the UAO. The assumptions that are made, well, let me get to actuarial, I'm sorry, because I want to define that as well. Actuarial means it is a pre-funded retirement system, meaning all the costs for the earned benefits are covered by money contributed prior to retirement and the drawing of those benefits. This is unlike a pay-as-you-go system, which some of you may be familiar with because of school districts that provided retiree health benefits. Retiree health benefits generally are what's referred to as other post-employment benefits, OPEBs. Those usually are pay-as-you-go. The employer has not reserved money and invested that money in order to pay for the value of that healthcare benefit that was accrued in the year in which they earned that benefit. Instead, pay-as-you-go means the paying agency will pay whatever the cost is that year from the resources that are available to the agency. And usually that means out of current revenues. Actuarial means instead of doing pay-as-you-go, we will take contributions and invest them. Currently, CalSTRS invests the funds, does a very, very good job at investing the funds. Approximately 58 to 60% of the earned benefit that people have from CalSTRS is paid for by the investment earnings. Where do you have the money for the investment earnings? Well, first from prior investment earnings, being continued to be investment and continuing to earn, and then in new contribution rates. The new contribution rates are conceptually broken down into two pieces for CalSTRS. Number one is normal costs, paying for the value of the benefits being earned this year. If the contribution rates are greater than what is needed for the normal cost, those will either be used to create a surplus if you're already 100% funded, or will be used to pay for the unfunded obligation. The CalSTRS Full Funding Act dealt with both of those issues, where new employees that were being hired would have to pay the normal cost, 50% of the normal cost, and the employer would pay 50% of the normal cost. If you have the normal cost fully covered and all your assumptions on earnings are correct, then you should have no unfunded obligation being generated for that earnings in that year. So a change in contribution rates. What would cause a change in contribution rates? One, increase in normal costs. Number two, increase in the unfunded actuarial obligation. Both of those will start talking about a change in contribution rates that are needed in order to get and we achieve 100% full funding. You want 100% full funding because otherwise you do not have enough assets to pay for the benefits you're obligated to pay for. So what else happens? Right now, as you can see, numbers are a snapshot in time because most of the calculation of the unfunded obligation, like I say, is built upon normal costs, contributions for the unfunded obligation, and the unfunded obligation being driven by factors such as longevity of retirees, the value of the earned benefit, the rate of return for CalSTRS. Those are projections that are used to make normal costs. And if you're wrong on those projections, then you're creating an unfunded obligation.
Dave, could I throw out one more issue that's important because I think we're going to bring it up later on in the presentation, and that's the ratio of active members to retired members. As you have, if you are out of balance and you have more retirees than active educators, that's going to create a fiscal and structural imbalance in the fund, which can also increase that unfunded actuarial obligation.
Correct. And what Jennifer is talking about in a little bit more detail, and she'll get into some of that, is if you have fewer current members paying in, in some of their contribution, in some of the employer, in particular, the employer contribution, which is based on covered payroll of current educators. And if there's few, then the covered payroll is less than expected. The amount of the employer contribution that's being used for the unfunded obligation, already earned, remember, already earned, is not enough to cover. And to do that, if you have two things happening: one, you're not getting enough money in from the employer to cover, but two, CalSTRS has to change its asset allocation from longer term investments to shorter term investments. And that shorter term investments tend to not earn as much in percentage terms. Jennifer will go into this and what some of the threats are on the horizon that causes you to be there. But yes, even if all your other assumptions were correct, if that assumption is incorrect, then you have an increase in the unfunded obligation. What happens when you reduce your assumption on earned and future earnings on the unfunded obligation? And that's essentially for each 0.25% of rate of return. So let's say from the current assumption of 7%, CalSTRS decides that the nature of investments and earnings, because of changes in economics in a more global nature, that growth is not going to be as great as previously anticipated. Then the earnings will be less, economic growth, the earnings will be less. And so to adjust their assumptions, they reduce the rate of return, called the discount rate, by 0.25%. That means the unfunded actuarial obligation will increase by $11 billion. That doesn't mean it's $11 billion a year. It doesn't mean CalSTRS needs to write a check for $11 billion. What it does mean is that instead of $107 billion of unfunded obligation, you now have $118 billion of unfunded obligation. If you're trying to pay off your unfunded obligation over originally it was going to be about a 42-year period. We've gone through, what is it, Jennifer, 8 years now?
Yeah, it's actually 32, and we were
32,
slated
right,
to finish paying it off by 2043.
Okay, that's where the 40 comes in. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
2 years. And so the less time you have to pay off the unfunded obligation when it increases, then the amount of contribution rate increase has to be greater than what would happen if it occurred earlier in the process when you have an unfunded obligation. The full funding plan assumed that we would have a fairly high unfunded obligation in the first years, and that as the excess contributions to pay it off came in and were invested, those investments would help pay down, just like a home mortgage. First year of a home mortgage, you pay more in interest than in principal. But as you pay more and more in on an amortized mortgage, by the last years of the mortgage, you're paying a lot more in principal than in interest. That was similar to the way the long-term funding program was developed. And by the way, Jennifer was deeply involved in that. So she is very, very familiar with those issues. So looking at this, we have an unfunded obligation, 105.7, got adjusted, 0.25, 116.7. That means as it goes up from anticipated, we have to start looking at changes in the plan. Under the law, those who were what I would call, there's a term, it's not vintage, it's not heritage, legacy employees, those hired before Pepper, are because of the California plan, are capped on California rule, capped on the amount of contribution they are required to pay. Contracts are contracts. They made a contract that they would pay X amount of their salaries in order to receive the benefit. The employer is the one in the state who are obligated to start covering those costs if the employer in the state made incorrect assumptions. So for the legacy, for the newer employees, we refer to them as 2% at 62, because the new employees not only had a contribution rate that would vary by normal cost, but also a reduction in their retirement benefits. They will be, as the normal cost goes up, they will have to pay more in contribution. That increase does not help pay the unfunded obligation. And in fact, because unless the employer contribution goes up, then there's less money available. Example, let's say everybody was subject to the 2% at 62. And the unfunded obligation went up, and the normal cost went up by enough, where the contribution rate for normal cost went up for both the employee and the employer. And let's say it goes from 10 to 11% for each. The employer had been contributing 19% of pay, let's say. If the employer keeps paying 19% of pay, instead of the difference between the 10% for normal costs and the 9% being used to pay off the unfunded obligation, the difference is now 11% for normal costs and only 8 percentage points available to pay off the unfunded obligation, meaning there's not enough money now. In order to meet the unfunded obligation payments to get to full funding, the employer rate has to go up. When the employer rate goes up, that means there's less money available for classroom expenditures. And they need additional revenue from the state in order to pay for those costs. The contribution rates and the assumptions, longevity, earnings, age of retirement, length of retirement, all of those assumptions we know are wrong. We just do not know by how much and in which direction. And with really good luck, when we're wrong and the unfunded obligation goes up 1 year, the next year we'll be wrong and the unfunded obligation will go down, and we'll have counterbalancing errors. The greatest problem is when we have errors, we don't adjust for the errors, and we don't have counterbalancing, and they last for a while. And that is what happened in the decade prior to the enactment of the Full Funding Act.
Dave, can I throw out a couple of other examples to really illustrate how this is a snapshot in time, because we are seeing some of the systemic numbers changing. Over the last few years of the implementation of AB 1469, which is the full funding plan, we did see additional payments by both Governor Brown and Governor Newsom to help to pay down this unfunded actuarial obligation for CalSTRS. So essentially, think of it like a mortgage. You're making an extra payment. And that doesn't mean that your next payment is going to be reduced. But what it does mean is that if you do enough of those, instead of, if you had a 30-year mortgage, maybe instead of having a 30-year mortgage, maybe you might now have a 26-year mortgage. So both current and previous governors have each done that. So we also have to take that into account when we're bringing up future scenarios that could involve the unfunded actuarial obligation going up. Doesn't mean that it will, but CalSTRS has some fantastic actuaries. And if you really enjoy conversations like this, let me tell you, the November board meeting of the Teachers Retirement Board, they're going to be going over different scenarios, various fiscal threats that can impact the unfunded actuarial obligation. And they're also going to be talking about opportunities, things that could make it better. So we always see some of these numbers shifting. One of the challenges that we're really going to be evaluating over the next few years is school enrollment. As enrollment declines, that's going to begin to squeeze school district budgets. But yet we're also seeing additional state funds. And so we may see some overall school budgets grow, but yet in the long run, there's going to be this reckoning with having to deal with enrollment declines. Enrollment declines mean that there may not be as many teachers in the classroom as we saw before. When you have a reduction in the overall number of teachers, that means that the shift that we were talking about earlier of your active to retiree ratio could get altered. So that's a huge systemic factor that we're paying close attention to. And fortunately, there were some great experts with the Department of Finance and at CalSTRS that are taking a close eye at this issue. But each of these issues is essentially its own rabbit hole and has a number of economic factors, and some of them also have political factors that we have to monitor to try to assess, is this going to help? Is this going to hinder? What seeds do we need to plant now to help some of these conversations to grow? Or maybe we need to get a little bit of weed killer to try to take care of some of the more controversial ones as well.
So we promise that we will not spend this much time on each of the slides, and definitely not going forward. So let's go to the next slide. Because the next slide is essentially saying CalSTRS has the right and the ability to increase employer contribution rates up to 20.25% of covered payroll. That prior to this time, prior to the full funding law, CalSTRS could not increase employer contribution rates, which created a very significant conflict. This ability to adjust employer contribution rates gives them the flexibility to address some of the issues that they will need to address if the unfunded obligation grows faster than anticipated. They also have the ability, and by the way, it's capped at 20.25%. They also have the ability to increase the state contribution by up to 0.5% of the covered payroll each year. That one is not capped. And so the state right now is seeing annual increases in their contribution by 0.5%. And that will be going on, we're not sure how long, all depends upon what the changes in normal cost are, what the projections are for the unfunded obligation. But the state's willingness to increase its payment from the general fund to the school CalSTRS in order to buy down and eliminate the unfunded obligation is a very, very positive step. We won't talk about the state had not been as willing prior to the passage of this legislation. Again, normal costs for legacy educators, 2% at 60. They are 2% at age 60. If you retire at age 60, your factor is 2% of your creditable compensation for the number of years of service. So if 25 years of service, 2%, 50%, 50% of your creditable compensation, annual creditable compensation would be your retirement allowance. This is for those at 2% at 62, they can have it adjusted. Right now, There has not been an increase, what, 3 years, Jennifer, 4 years in this rate? If there are changes in the assumptions, then this rate could change. The normal cost could change. Their contribution rates could go up, and that would naturally put pressure on employers to ensure that there's sufficient salary. So it's not a salary cut because there's a contribution rate increase.
If I could add, Dave, one way to also think about this is thinking about it in context for the current environment. You're talking about our newest teachers, and as you all know, we have an extremely significant teacher shortage, and it's beginning to get worse. It's not lost that there is quite a significant amount of irony that our newest teachers have a reduced formula. So when PEPRA, this Pension Reform Act, was created a number of years ago, they really didn't think about that in a long term and think about how that was going to impact, for example, education, the ability to recruit and retain teachers for the long run. But Dave, I do have a question for you. So I seem to remember a number of very colorful conversations when about 10 years ago and when AB 1469 was being discussed. And those colorful conversations were about the authority, whether or not any authority should be given to the Teachers Retirement Board to raise rates because of the impact that that could have on Prop 98 funding. And I keenly remember those colorful conversations and taking turns throwing each other under the bus as we tried to chew on those issues. So Dave, why is it important that there's a limit, and why should we care?
It's important that there be a limit on the employer side because the fear we had at the time was that a governor could decide that they wanted to overfund. I mean, not simply have a target of 100%, but they wanted a target of, call it 150% of CalSTRS funding. So it would be overfunded. And to get there, they would really increase employer contribution rates by more than 1% a year and get to a point where there would be significant pressure on the employers because Proposition 98 is a minimum guarantee. You could essentially use employer contribution rates on school districts and educators as a leverage point in order to have other things done. And the fear was there might be some future governor who would have that desire. Because these are statutory, many of us felt more comfortable with a cap, both on how much could be done in a year, as well as how much could be done in toto. So educators would not be potentially leveraged for making concessions and non-retirement issues in order to not have a overfunding at CalSTRS with funds that were not needed in order to fully fund the system. On the state side, however, it was perfectly good to have no cap there because quite frankly, it is, the state is the ultimate guarantor of the plan unless there's some really horrible fiscal situation. And the courts have been clear that if it's a truly, truly desperate type of situation, similar to what you might call the Great Depression of the 20s and 30s, the state would have the authority to make modifications in the benefit. But outside of that, the state does not have the authority to make modifications of already earned benefits, and the state under the California rule has the ultimate responsibility for funding. In that case, there's no reason for the state to be capped on anything other than how much they could increase or decrease in any particular year.
Dave, can I add something to that? And that's the fact that the expertise on the Teachers Retirement Board that oversees CalSTRS, they're experts in retirement. They're experts in the retirement fund. They're not experts in education funding. We do have three elected members to the board. Wouldn't it be great if we had a retiree elected to the board sometime? But there are 2 K-12 and 1 community college elected members to the board. 6 out of the 12 members of the board are controlled by the governor, which is why we were very sensitive to those conversations. And it should be noted, when many of these discussions took place, this was just a few years after our previous governor, Schwarzenegger, tried to take over the board and put some individuals on the board that literally wanted to see the elimination of CalSTRS and having a defined benefit. So these were real scenarios that were taking place that really impacted the tone of the conversations at that time. It also should be noted that because the Teachers Retirement Board are not experts in education policy, they may not understand the nuances in the decisions that they make and how those decisions ultimately could impact the classrooms. And so that's one of the reasons why the compromise was created as far as giving them a box that they need to stay in, can't go over the 20.25%. But yet they still have authority to move up and down given a specific range. So that was felt to be an effective way of dealing with that situation. It does make it more difficult for CalSTRS, though, to address an unfunded actuarial obligation. When CalPERS, the brother on the other side of the river, since they're just down the street from CalSTRS, when there's a shortfall to that fund, their board does have the authority to change contribution rates, and they make those changes accordingly. That is helpful to assist them in addressing any shortfalls quickly. But the downside is that has an immediate impact on employers, where suddenly employers are going to see their pension costs going up for next year, but they hadn't already anticipated that in their 3-year budget scenarios, and now they're going to make some changes. That's one of the reasons why when AB 1469 was created, it was created in a way that allowed the employer contributions to be phased in over time, and that 0.5% increase for the state to increase 0.5%. Now, it's great that that's steady, but if you actually need a 3% increase and you need that immediately, but you're going to be phasing that in, it's going to take 6 years to reach that 3-year increase. So now instead of needing 3%, you may need 4.15% over time. So that is the downside. Because it's phased in more slowly, that could increase some of the costs. But many of those issues can also be mitigated by seeing some of the additional buy downs in overall pension obligations that some of the governors have instituted. So the good news is it's not all negative, but we see a number of different factors that are influencing what those numbers are and how we look at them at that snapshot in time.
Thank you, Jennifer. I wasn't going to call out the governor by name that we were thinking about, but that's fine. We have been blessed by gubernatorial retiree appointees. Even the governor Jennifer was referring to made an excellent nomination. The current governor, well, Jerry Brown and then Governor Newsom, their appointment is a wonderful retiree appointment, easy to work with, sensitive to retiree issues. So we have been blessed with those appointments. But Jennifer is correct. The former governor who decided that he didn't believe in defined benefit pensions did create a level of uncertainty. Now, all of this is statutory, which means if the 20.25 cap needs to be increased, we can go back to the legislature and discuss increasing it. If we need to do more than 0.5% in some year, we can go back to the legislature and talk about that. So it's not as if this is in the Constitution and cannot be changed without a vote of the people. This is something that was designed to be flexible in order to try to address the variability of some of the assumptions, but also to be flexible in making adjustments down the road if we all agreed that we needed to make those adjustments. Next slide. This is the budget process that's shifted. And if we can go to the next. GAN Limit. Paul GAN of the Jarvis GAN duo. After Prop 13 was passed in 1978, which limited the property tax, well, actually cut the property tax revenues to local government. Mr. GAN sponsored another initiative, Proposition 4, which would cap the ability of the state to appropriate state revenues based upon their appropriations in 1978. And going forward, it would be adjusted by a cost of living adjustment and inflationary adjustment, but it wouldn't be able to be adjusted, and population, but it wouldn't be able to be adjusted for other reasons. This was done so the state wouldn't make significant increases in state taxes in order to have enough money to backfill the reductions in property tax. And essentially, it was a state tax limitation, just like the local tax limitation of Prop 13. That calculation, other than once during Governor Duke Majan's term, has not been actually triggered. We thought it was going to be triggered this year. The rate of the state general fund revenue growth has so far exceeded the inflationary and population growth changes that are allowed under Proposition 4, that for the first time we've covered the difference between state appropriations subject to limitation, and revenues. This has primarily been because of the significant progressivity of the state income tax. And we have so many more high income earners. Jennifer and I were kind of joking a little bit earlier about technology. And at times, you know, technology is something you can love. At times it's something you'll have problems with. Technology has created a lot of very, very high income earners in California. Silicon Valley, initial public offerings, stock options, all of these different things, because of the progressivity of the California income tax and very high number of very high earners, the state's revenue growth exploded. That has caused us to be at the limit. The state has exercised some of its exemptions to be under the limit, at least for this year. Governor Newsom yesterday mentioned that state revenues were increasing very fast, and that he didn't mention anything about potentially triggering GAN limit again, but you almost have to assume that that is an option out there. The state can average over 2 years, as Jennifer said previously. If there's an excess amount, even after that averaging, then half has to be returned to taxpayers by an adjustment in rates, and half must be made as additional spending per pupil, one-time spending that does not go into the Proposition 98 base, but has to be returned to schools. That was, by the way, one of the changes that was made to the limit prior to Proposition 98, which included the change of adding schools. All of it had to go back to taxpayers. So 98 made that adjustment. And then Proposition 111 made another adjustment, the 2-year averaging and like that, a little bit after the Prop 98. It appears it'll be in play for a number of years. Jennifer's been talking about governors previously making excess contributions. The legislative analyst has raised some questions about whether Proposition 2 can effectively be used for that. Rainy Day Fund. We talked about proposition numbers. We should give them better titles and give the year in which they're done. Rainy Day Fund 2012. That requires, if with state general fund revenues, you have to set aside some of those revenues for reserves. So when there is a downturn, there'll be state money to help cover some of those recessionary costs. There were some questions about how that would be used and how it would be calculated under GAN. So what we're doing is trying to set the stage essentially for the next slide.
Which can I pause for a second before we move to the next slide? Because I think it's important to also note that the Legislative Analyst's Office had, while they've noted that they believe that the GAN limit is going to be in effect for a number of years, we don't exactly know how many years it will likely be in effect, or it will have to be mitigated in some way in how that basically the way the legislature and the governor create the budget can help to mitigate whether or not it would effectively be triggered or not. But additionally, as Dave was noting, we have seen some very significant increases in the overall amount of revenue that the state is receiving, which is a boon and is very helpful. It's allowing for us to have the highest numbers in Prop 98 funding that we've ever seen historically. We're seeing different windfalls in different parts of the budget, but that is expected to essentially be whittled down over the next year or two. So those windfalls aren't here to stay, and these are all also snapshots in time, and different economic factors could trigger them. I wanted to actually. I'm going to throw you for a loop, Dave, and I'm going to take us back briefly for a moment in time. It wasn't that long ago that that the technology industry actually had a significantly negative impact on the California economy. So let's now harken back to 2003 and the dot-com bust. The dot-com bust created an over $30 billion shortfall in the state budget. It also created a very complicated political environment that led to the recall of then Governor Gray Davis. It additionally had a significant impact on the returns for CalSTRS, and as a result, created a $20 billion shortfall to the CalSTRS defined benefit plan. At the time, we thought that was a lot of money. It was only the 2008 Great Recession that we learned what a lot of money really turned out to be. But the reason that I bring it up is really to show how the pendulum is always shifting. And while the pendulum is very positive, one of the things that Dave and I need to do is constantly see, where is that going to move? Is it going to continue to move in a positive direction? Are there any factors that need to be considered? Do we need to assess whether the pendulum may eventually shift to a more complicated economic environment? So I wanted to note that yes, while technology can be very helpful, it hasn't always been a boom for the California economy, but we hope that it will continue to stay very positive.
Correct. And the dot-com bust was a major pain situation where we had to cut a lot of education programs. It did give us our first deferral process in order, so it allowed for a little creativity. But yes, when we talk about these things, Jerry Brown was absolutely correct. We don't just have growth. There are recessions. Nobody's repealed the business cycle. We might be flattening it, we hope, but probably we will, well, not probably, we will have another recession. Nobody at this time can predict when or how deep or how long. The one that we came out of, we've never seen a K recovery before, where the upper income recover quickly and in fact really don't have a recession to begin with and just have increases. The amount of wealth generation in the upper 1% during the recession caused by COVID is unbelievable. But the amount of wealth lost by middle class, lower middle class, those who are more economically challenged, that is also unbelievable. It really was a tale of two recessions, or a tale of one recession for a significant portion of the state population, and a non-recession, but boom times for a small percentage, although the people who pay most of the taxes percentage of the state population. Yes, this is going to be variable all over, always will be. And yes, that's why CalSTRS reviews its projections every 2 years and then major review every 4 years. And we all, and our partners. You know, it's not just CalRTA, I mean, CTA, CFT, AXA, all of us are continuing to look at this because of the effects it has on retirement, on teacher salaries, educational program provision. That is something we constantly all look at. And why should we care about the GAN limit? Other than those of us who are, what's a good way of phrasing it? We just kind of like this thing because it's just so intellectually challenging and intriguing. There are so many different moving parts to this. Anybody who tells you, I can tell you what's going to happen next year because of the GAN limit, be suspect. There are so many moving parts. It's still under discussion as to exactly how to interpret it. Remember, this is only potentially the second time it's been triggered. Was going to be the current year that we're in right now because of the 2-year blending. That is opened up a lot of different issues, a lot of different questions. We should care to the extent that we can find the additional contributions to help buy down the existing shortfall. That would be very helpful because in the long run, just like Jennifer said, if we can use windfalls, unexpected money that is not ongoing, that is actually limited term, we can use that to reduce long-term costs for public education. That is to our benefit. And we hope that Governor Newsom, when he made his announcement yesterday about additional state revenues, did talk about trying to use more of those revenues for buying down pension obligations. That's a very, very positive comment. Like I say, Jennifer and I are kind of interested in seeing how he's going to do that without triggering a GAN. But we're hoping that they have a really good idea. And in fact, in some ways, if they write the check and deposit the check, even if it's a bad idea, if we can cash the check, so be it. We'll take the money. We care. It's technical, it's complex. We care because it does affect the ability to pay pensions and have a fully funded system. Next slide.
Dave, can I actually throw out one? I guess it's a fiscal and a political issue to think about with the GAN limit. While it would be so helpful to make a supplemental payment on the unfunded actuarial obligation, that is the right economic thing to do. There are a number of school employers that are really concerned about pension costs going up next year because there was a buy down in the pension contribution rate for employers that we've seen over the last few years. That's going to be expiring in the fiscal year 22-23. So that's causing a lot of discussion around the water cooler in the Capitol, in the budget rooms, trying to discuss, should that be extended? Should that not be extended? Since schools are seeing such a windfall in funding, isn't it easy for them to be able to pay for the increased costs? Yet at the same time, we see enrollment going down. And so I'm wondering, to what extent will the discussions that those that want to see the continued buy down of employer contributions, to what extent might they influence a buy down of addressing the unfunded actuarial obligation, which would be the right fiduciary thing to do, correct? But that doesn't mean it will be the right political thing to do. So how influential do you think, or how much of a conflict do you think that addressing additional payment is going to be juxtaposed to pension contribution buy downs?
Correct. Well, first of all, I'm on the side of, when you get $9 billion a year of new money, you should be able to afford to pay $360 million of it for your contribution rate. But I'm on that side of the discussion. However, yes, it will be an issue. It has lots of different factors. There are multiple technical ways to deal with it without doing buy downs. And whether the state will use any of those technical means, I don't know. But yes, it will be part of the conversation. The governor was not recalled. Does the governor want to show that he is a good fiscal steward? And does that outweigh what the employers might be thinking as far as their contribution rate? Are there concerns about being able to provide adequate funding to address the teacher shortage? Meaning, is there discussion, or will there be discussion of increased, well, it's been so long since we've done this, the state, excuse me, create a much better beginning teacher salary, where we say this is the minimum beginning teacher salary in order to attract more people into the profession. That also starts affecting how much employers have to do. All of those things, I think, are part of the conversation as we go forward. How it will shake out, I do not know, but I think you're absolutely right that the employers will say, oh, we can't afford this. We need to continue to have this buy down.
So
I'm not sure how much time we have left.
And we can go through these are going to be some very colorful discussions on as well on some of the next slides, and that's the other CalSTRS conversations. We're always focusing on the macro issues, because at the end of the day, we want to make sure that your paychecks are secure and that they continue for the duration of your lifetime as well as your beneficiary's lifetime. That said, as you know, those aren't the only conversations taking place at CalSTRS. Dave and I were talking about a number of fiscal and also political scenarios that we might see starting to take place during the next budget discussion. That potentially could have an influence on some of the other policy and fiscal discussions that might be taking place at the same time. So I wanted to make sure that you were aware of some of those discussions. And that's some other short-term priorities. Many of you may agree that trying to increase the supplemental benefit maintenance account, which provides purchasing power, is a major priority. We've continued to see it as a major priority for CalRTA members. That's been reflected in the platform survey. So we are having conversations to see what kind of action can take place. to make some changes and trigger an increase in SBMA to create more equity for the retirees that are the oldest and that have been most hindered by some of the various tiers that have been created over the years between our retirees. So we're having conversations with stakeholders. We're having conversations with CalSTRS to see what we might be able to do, perhaps in this next legislative session, whether it's going to be a policy measure, whether it's going to be a budget discussion or assessing the right environment to try to move that conversation forward. That's a major priority, but this is also a fiscal issue. It's going to be very difficult. So you have to think of how are our legislators going to view this discussion? Because typically most of the discussions they're hearing right now about CalSTRS and pensions have to deal with employer obligations, so those contribution rates, and they're hearing from employers saying those pension rates are going up. And then they also hear about CalSTRS primarily when it comes to issues around the shortfall and addressing that shortfall or divestment discussions. And then suddenly they'll be thrown into an environment where they're going to hear about a fund at CalSTRS that is over 110% funded, and it might not make sense to them. Because they're used to hearing, oh, there are these shortfalls, and then their first assumption is to say, well, can't we just take the extra funding from this account and roll it into the other account? And then we have to have a very long conversation with them to explain to them why no, you can't do that. And as a matter of fact, a previous governor tried to do that, and CalRTA and friends took them to court to protect the SBMA funding. But it becomes somewhat of a complicated discussion because we are dealing with one aspect or one fund that is overfunded, and we are having a discussion about a slight enhancement to provide equity for the oldest of our retirees. So it doesn't mean that it's something that can't be done. But if some of the other fiscal and political conversations get very tense or complicated, as you all know, that could bleed into other conversations. So this is an example of a conversation where it could cause us to have to spend more time addressing issues on the margins so that we can focus on what the ultimate goal is at the end of the day. One of the other discussions that's been taking place is an issue called, we've been calling it the statute of limitations. And essentially what's been happening is CalSTRS has been increasing the number of audits that they've been conducting over the years. And the ultimate goal is to try to ensure that all of the data that it has in its system is correct. That's a very good goal. The problem that we're seeing is that over the years, there have been some systemic problems in the system. It's not just CalSTRS, but the way in which information is reported, how information is communicated, and how to assess whether information that's being communicated from CalSTRS is correct or incorrect. So ultimately, there are a lot of different holes. And as we've been discussing this issue further, we've been realizing that there are many more complex issues that need to be addressed. Why should you care? Well, if CalSTRS conducts an audit and they find out that you have been underpaid, well, congratulations. You're going to get a paycheck from CalSTRS and your retirement check is going to be increased. That's a wonderful scenario, and we wish that that were constantly the case for retirees. Unfortunately, there is a small population. It's not the most significant. However, there is a small population of retirees who CalSTRS has overpaid, and it's not through any fault of the retiree. They met with CalSTRS, they met with a counselor, they met with their district. They did everything they needed to do to ensure that that the information that CalSTRS and the district had was correct. And then they based their long-term retirement plans on that information, only to find out through a CalSTRS audit a number of years later that what was provided to CalSTRS was not correct. Now, sometimes it is a district error. It's not always a district error, though. We've also found out that some districts had contacted CalSTRS to verify whether or not they could apply a bargaining agreement in a certain way, and CalSTRS had told them, yes, this is fine, only then to be audited a number of years later and to have another arm of CalSTRS saying, oh, no, you can't do that. And they said, but we actually have communication from you saying that this was okay. So that's created a number of some confusion and some complexities that we, as well as other stakeholders, are working with CalSTRS to try to address. It is very possible that there may ultimately be legislation introduced to try to deal with this issue, because the only way to address some of those systemic factors is going to be through legislation. So the reason I bring it up is this is a complicated issue, because we have to talk about audits and how CalSTRS works and how it works with school and community college districts, how it impacts retirees. These conversations are never easy. We can't have these conversations with a 30-second soundbite that's going to be easy to post on Twitter or on Facebook. These issues are so complex that we have to take the time to sit down and have those long conversations. That could become tricky if some of the other fiscal discussions around contributions, long-term funding, SBMA come into play. So all of these issues ultimately become interrelated, and they also become interrelated into an environment where we're still being impacted by COVID when it comes to the legislature and how they function. Remember, over the last 2 years, we have seen a significant reduction in the number of bills that have been introduced by the legislature because of COVID. In addition to that, they have been limiting the amount of bills that deal with certain topics, and they've been trying to only have bills move forward that are directly impacting COVID or the economy. So as a result, there is a tremendous backlog of bills that have not been introduced over the next few years, and the pressure of those bills is mounting, which means if we need to have certain conversations about some issues like the SBMA or the statute of limitations conversation, but something else comes into play, that might take all the air out of the room and might make it harder to move multiple issues that are related to CalSTRS. Doesn't mean that's all going to happen, but these are some of the political issues that Dave and I have to assess as we're trying to navigate the very myriad of issues that we're dealing with at the Capitol. While we're doing that, we're also assessing threats from opponents that are happening almost constantly in the retirement world. We've continued to see a number of attacks on defined benefit plans. This has been something where when we had a number of pension initiatives that were filed over around a decade ago, we had seen quite a few introduced on a regular basis. As we fought back on them, we saw them decline. We hadn't seen any for a while, knock on wood, but we would occasionally see some anti-defined benefit rhetoric in newspapers or op-eds. We've always kept a lookout for those. We still have them on occasion, but we have seen them beginning to increase. And then additionally, we've seen individuals actually working to implement anti-pension discussions into actual boardrooms. That happened in Marin this year. Earlier this year, the Marin County Board of Education had a resolution that they were considering passing. The resolution was not only full of completely incorrect and misinformation, it wasn't even grammatically correct. So it was clear that some other organization with an agenda to eliminate CalSTRS and CalPERS clearly infiltrated discussions, talked some members of the board and the school district into considering this resolution. And it was only through the work of CalRTA and some other very prominent local stakeholders getting involved and pushing back against Marin that they decide to stop that resolution. President Breyer with CalRTA had sent a letter to the Marin board. It was very long letter explaining why the assumptions that the districts made were incorrect. We really worked to go on record to try to be a sounding board for what the reality actually is. in case we were to see any additional resolutions like this. So we're always on the lookout, but we were shockingly disappointed to see an educational institution that should be priding itself on factual information that's based on the actual facts for CalSTRS and CalPERS to not be considered by a school district. But fortunately, that didn't move forward, but we will stay on the lookout. And then we have seen actually 2 voucher initiatives that have been filed. I only included one right now because that's the one that we've had the new title and summary. The initial name was the Educational Freedom Act that the proponents had filed, but the Attorney General's office recently came out with a new title that notes that it's a public funding of religious and other private education. So essentially what this would do is it would have the state pay for religious and private schools. And they would get a $14,000 voucher essentially. And there are so many reasons not to like this because of the decimating impact that this would have on public education in our schools. But what many individuals may not also realize is it would have a significantly negative impact on CalSTRS as well. And one of the primary reasons is that teacher ratio that Dave and I were talking about earlier. When you look at the active to retirement teacher ratio, this would dramatically curtail the number of teachers that we have in our public schools and would work to shift them to private schools through the reduction of kids that are actually going to traditional public schools. Every time a teacher were to move over, you are reducing that overall payroll and you are shifting those long-term economic factors that impact the unfunded actuarial obligation. So this would actually be a systemic threat from that perspective. But when you actually shift the number of active teachers that you have, and if you were to dramatically decrease them, that's now impacting the total amount of payroll funding that's going to CalSTRS. That's something that their investment team is going to have to take into consideration. If it is significant enough, they may have to actually change the asset allocation that they have for the future, which means they have to change the kind of investments that they're making. That can also have an impact on what their assumed rate of return is going to be in the long run. That could cause the Teachers Retirement Board to have to consider in one of its future conversations whether or not they need to change the rate of return to make sure it's more realistic with what the new asset allocation and investment returns would be. And if that were to happen, it's important to note that the rate of return for the supplemental benefit maintenance account, which provides purchasing power for our oldest retirees, that amount is automatically set to be the same amount of the defined benefit fund. So if sometime in the future, doesn't mean again, if this will happen, but it's something that's important to note. If there is a change to the rate of return in the defined benefit fund, and if that rate is lowered, that would mean that the SBMA funds rate would also be lowered to whatever that equivalent amount would be. So this is something that we're obviously paying a lot of attention to. There is an additional voter initiative that was filed, and I'm anticipating that the Attorney General's office is going to be coming out with title and summary, if not this week, then next week. We'll be monitoring that. We have also seen we've seen other initiatives filed that could potentially have impacts on CalSTRS. There's one regarding high quality education, and anything that impedes the ability to have a high quality education can automatically be repealed. Someone could theoretically say, well, the costs of pensions are inhibiting the ability to have a high quality education, so let's get rid of those. So there are obviously many, many threats. These don't all come to fruition. Just as we've seen a lot of initiatives in the past that tried to eliminate CalSTRS's defined benefit plan, we work to fight against those. We're continuing to monitor threats. Not all threats wind up being real, but it is important to know your surroundings. And so that's what we're doing. We're monitoring what's happening. We're assessing to see if any of them get legs. We do want to encourage you that if someone comes up and asks you to sign this, tell them no, don't give them money. Tell your friends, tell your family. These are not good. They would have a major impact on public education, and they would have a major impact on your retirement security. So we wanted to make sure that you were aware of those threats, because obviously, if anything like this were to happen, it would absolutely throw open all of the various scenarios that Dave and I discussed during this webinar, and it would have to make us completely reevaluate. It would eliminate AB 1469 and the funding plan. That wouldn't be able to move forward as planned. And so we're monitoring because we want to make sure that any threats are dealt with. And it does make our job very exciting because we really enjoy going down those rabbit holes. I have to tell you, Susie Dixon gets to hear us having a number of these conversations when we have our weekly briefing. And so with that, what I wanted to do is open it up to questions that you might have. I know that we went over a lot of very technical information. You don't have to be an expert. That's what you have us for. But we want you to try to have a realistic understanding of what's out there. So if you do have any questions, I'd like to encourage you to use the chat box. And I can't see everyone. Let me stop my screen share. But if you do have a question that you wanted to ask in person, if you could turn your screen on and raise your hand, I will be able to see that. But if we don't have any questions, what I wanted to let you know is this, the PowerPoint and the webinar are going to be sent out to you in an email. We are also going to have that available on the CalRTA website. So if there's something that you wanted to rewatch to better understand, feel free to do so. And with that,
We have a question from Irene on SBMA impact.
SB. Now, are you talking, Irene, about the impact of the vouchers on the SBMA? Because if you are,
I actually would like to know the status.
oh, the well, 112. I believe it's around 112% funded. So we have checked in with the CalSTRS actuaries because we've seen inflation on the rise. And we know that there could be future discussions in 2023 about rate of return. And so we've checked in with them to say, hey, based on the rate of return, based on how things are going, do you anticipate that that's going to have a significant economic impact on the surplus for the SBMA fund? And they said, it's looking good. You don't need to worry. It looks like that's very stable. So unless we were to see some very dramatic economic activity taking place, the good news is that that surplus is still there and it's doing great.
So there is a question on, will CalSTRS have enough money to pay for me? I'm 79. Will CalSTRS system have enough for me until I die at 101? The answer is yes, they will. There's still $300 billion worth of assets. The full funding plan is working. This is why we're making sure that it does stay implemented and stays on track. So the answer is yes. CalSTRS will have enough to pay your full pension until you no longer live.
And Irene wants to know if there will be a short article for local newsletters. You know, you're more than welcome to write a synopsis and then also include the links on if you have electronic newsletters. I will see if I can write something up, although we're really going into some technical issues, and I almost I hate to condense it that much, because usually when we explain these issues, you almost need a short novel to explain them, or a dissertation. But we might be able to do some short blurbs on that.
This is Irene here. And so as a newsletter editor, we want to warn our people not to sign any petitions, and so maybe just a quick little warning and then a link to more information.
Yeah. Well, here, what I would encourage you to do, we had a legislative alert last Wednesday, and we also had one yesterday. If you are not signed up for the alerts, you can actually do that on the CalRTA website, and I'd really encourage you to do so. We had a summary of each initiative and the potential impact that it would have on public education and CalSTRS in both of those legislative alerts. You could simply cut and paste. We have all of the information that you would need for a local newsletter in that. Feel free to use as you see fit.
Perfect, thank you.
If there are no other questions, what I would like to do is say thank you so much for taking the time to learn more about your retirement, how it works. And we hope that we've reassured you that we are looking at every single factor that can help or hinder your retirement. And we're out there fighting for you, making sure that, that your retirement is going to be there, not only until you're 101. We're seeing a lot more retirees that are 100 years old. So we're going to make sure that it's there for you. And with that, I want to say thank you so much. Have a great day, everyone, and stay safe.